Good evening, everyone. This week's rant will be about physiology and the road to modern psychology. Now, this era was a big step in psychology's development. We are moving beyond mere theorizing and moving into an era of greater emphasis on actual experimentation. Now, every era deserves a good debate, and this one was no exception. In the past, previously, we had empiricists versus idealists, empiricists versus rationalists, monists versus dualists, and this week's contenders are vitalism versus materialism. Now, the vitalism versus materialism debate was for physiology and biology what the mind body debate was for philosophy. In brief, vitalism is the idea that life cannot be explained solely by chemical or physical processes. There is something more, a intangible life force that is beyond the reach of scientific experimentation. Materialism, by contrast, posits that life can be explained by chemical processes and physical processes, and that nothing is beyond the reach of science. So when you take the idea of materialism and you combine that with that increased emphasis on experimentation, then that spurs a lot of activity. For instance, vitalists and the theorists that came before them held the belief that nerve conduction was instantaneous. It was a great idea. They loved it. They were so comfortable with it that they never bothered to check it, to test it out, to see if it was actually true or not. Spoiler, it wasn't. But it took us until the 1850s and von Helmholtz's experiments to prove that. Another example would be the work of the infamous Franz Joseph Gall. Last week we talked about the idea of faculty psychology, originally just concepts or constructs. He actually went a step further with this and assigned those faculties to specific regions of the brain. Now, this, of course, would lead us to the great dumpster fire that is otherwise known as phrenology, which was admittedly popular for a time. It at least attempted to answer questions about behavior. Most of their details were wildly inaccurate, and if they did get any parts right, it was probably through sheer luck. But the basic idea in itself was not such a bad idea. The idea that certain areas of the brain are associated with certain processes, also known as localization, is an idea that, while it isn't as absolute or rigid or compartmentalized as he imagined it to be, is one that did find support, and we are still finding support for today. To start with, Paul Broca found evidence for a specific area that was devoted to the production of speech. Not long after that, Carl Wernicke found another area that seemed to be closely associated with speech comprehension. Fritsch and Hitzig discovered the motor area of the brain, and Ferrier actually mapped out the area of the cortex that was associated with sensory input. And bringing us even closer to what we now consider as experimental psychology, around the same time as these other fellows, Ernst Weber started trying to actually quantify the relationship between stimuli and sensations or perception. You have read likely by now the 2-point threshold, which he is now famous for. And a fellow named Fechner went even further and developed a mathematical model for sensation. And if you haven't yet read about the adventures of Dr. Mises, I highly recommend it. Trust me, you'll enjoy it. So while there were some blind alleys and wrong turns along the way, physiology really laid the groundwork for what we now know as modern experimental psychology. That's my rant for the week. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. If not, my apologies. As for comments, you know the drill, writing it by now, located down there somewhere. And we will see you in the future.